Listen closely, my friends. I need you to think about the last time someone said something to you, something small, maybe even throw away. And it stuck. It replayed in your head for hours, maybe days. You rehearsed what you should have said. You imagined the conversation differently. You went over it again and again, even when you were trying to sleep. Now here's the question nobody asks. Where were you during all of that? Not physically. I mean, where was your mind, your focus, your peace? Gone. Handed over. Given away completely to someone who probably forgot what they said 5 minutes after they said it. That's not just a bad day. That's a pattern. And if you've never identified it for what it is, it's been quietly running your life. What I'm going to share with you is not motivational content. It's not a list of tips. It's not feel-good advice that you'll forget by tomorrow morning. This is a complete psychological and philosophical framework built on over 2,000 years of Stoic thinking that will fundamentally change the way you move through the world. By the time this is over, you will understand exactly why the most powerful people in history, emperors, generals, philosophers, leaders, all shared one trait that most people overlook entirely. They knew when not to speak. They knew when not to react. They knew that silence, real, intentional, chosen silence, is not emptiness. It's architecture. It's the structure that holds everything else together. And here's what's going to feel uncomfortable as we go through this. You're going to recognize yourself in almost everything I describe. The patterns, the reactions, the exhaustion that comes from constantly responding to a world that doesn't deserve all of you. That recognition, don't run from it. That's exactly where the shift begins. Stay with me. This is going to take everything and give you back far more. Law 1. Your reaction is not your response. It is your surrender. Let's start with something that might sound simple, but runs deeper than almost anything else we'll cover today. There is a difference, a massive, life-changing difference, between a reaction and a response. A reaction is automatic. It happens before you decide anything. It's the flinch, the sharp reply, the defensive text sent at midnight, the need to correct someone in front of other people, the justification that spills out before you've even finished forming the thought. Reactions are fast, emotional, and almost always costly. A response is something else entirely. A response is chosen. It's deliberate. It comes from a place of awareness, not impulse. And the most important thing about a response, sometimes it doesn't come at all. Sometimes the most powerful response is the decision not to engage. Marcus Aurelius, Emperor of Rome, arguably the most powerful man on earth during his lifetime, wrote privately in his journal something that most leaders never say out loud. He wrote that his greatest daily battle was not with his enemies, not with the political threats surrounding him, and not with the vastness of an empire to manage. His greatest battle was mastering his own impulse to react. Think about that for a moment. This is a man commanding armies, a man whose word was law, a man surrounded by people who competed for his attention and tested his patience daily. And the thing he fought hardest, the urge to respond before he was ready, because he understood what most people still haven't figured out. The moment you react, you've shown your hand. You've revealed what moves you, what disturbs you, what has the power to pull you out of your own center. And once someone knows what moves you, they have leverage over you, whether they're consciously using it or not. Now let's bring this closer to home. Think about the people in your life who seem untouchable. Not cold, untouchable. The ones who, when someone tries to provoke or diminish them, simply don't take the bait. They don't get visibly flustered. They don't raise their voice. They don't need to win the argument in the room. There's something magnetic about those people, isn't there? Something that commands respect without demanding it. You might have always assumed that was just personality, something you're either born with or you're not. It isn't. It's a practice, a daily, deliberate, sometimes uncomfortable practice, and it starts with understanding one thing clearly. Your reaction is never just a reaction. It is a small surrender of your sovereignty. Every time you let something external dictate your internal state, you've handed the wheel over. You may still be sitting in the driver's seat, but someone else is steering. Epictetus knew this better than almost anyone. Born into slavery, literal, legal, physical slavery, he developed a philosophy not of escape, but of internal freedom. He understood that no one could take from him what he chose to protect: his judgments, his values, his responses. These were his, and only his, regardless of what happened around him. He taught this: between stimulus and response, there is a space. Most people have never learned to find that space. They live so close to the surface of experience that stimulus and response feel like the same thing. Something happens, and they immediately act. Something is said, and they immediately reply. Someone pushes, and they immediately push back. The entire project of Stoic philosophy, and frankly, the entire project of becoming genuinely powerful in your own life, is about finding that space and learning to live in it. Here's what that looks like practically. The next time someone says something designed to get under your skin, whether it's a passive-aggressive comment at work, a dismissive remark from someone close to you, or an outright provocation from someone who barely knows you, try something before you do anything else. Notice it. Just notice the impulse. Feel it rising. Observe it the way you'd observe a wave rolling in from the ocean. The wave is real. It has force, but you don't have to be swept away by it. That single act of noticing, of creating even 1 second of awareness between the stimulus and the response, is the beginning of everything. It doesn't feel like power. Not at first. It feels like restraint, like you're holding something back that wants to come out. And it might feel uncomfortable, even wrong, like you're letting something go unanswered. But here's what's actually happening in that moment of restraint. You are choosing. You are exercising the only freedom that no one can ever take from you. The freedom to decide how you engage with what happens to you. That is not weakness. That is the foundation of every form of real power. Law 2. Silence is not the absence of strength. It is its fullest expression. We live in a culture that has fundamentally confused noise with power. The loudest voice in the room is assumed to be the most confident. The fastest reply is taken as the sharpest mind. The person who always has a comeback, who never lets anything go unanswered, who is permanently, visibly engaged in every conversation. They get labeled as dominant, assertive, formidable. And yet, watch what happens to them over time. They become predictable. People learn how to play them. They know exactly which buttons to press to get a reaction, and they press them. The person who always responds has, without realizing it, made themselves transparent. Their emotional machinery is on display, and a machine you can see is a machine you can manipulate. Contrast that with silence, real silence. Not the silence of having nothing to say, not the silence of fear or uncertainty, but the silence of someone who has genuinely decided that this moment, this comment, this situation does not warrant their engagement. That kind of silence is deeply unsettling to the people around it. Not because it's aggressive, not because it's cold or dismissive, but because it creates something people are not comfortable with: uncertainty. When you respond, you give feedback. You confirm that the other person's words landed, that they registered, that they produced an effect. Even a hostile response is a kind of validation. It says, "You reached me." Silence says nothing of the kind. Silence leaves the other person with nothing to hold on to. No emotional signal, no confirmation of impact. And into that void, they will pour everything: their assumptions, their anxiety, their questions. While you are calm and centered, they are the ones spinning. The ancient Stoics had a word for this kind of internal stability: apatheia. It has been badly mistranslated and misunderstood over the centuries. It does not mean apathy in the modern sense: indifference, numbness, not caring about anything. It means something closer to imperturbability, the state of being unmoved by what is outside your control. Not because you feel nothing, but because you have developed the discipline not to be ruled by what you feel. And silence is one of the most visible expressions of apatheia that exists. Think about the most respected figures you've ever encountered, in person, in history, in literature. The ones who carried genuine weight, the ones whose presence in a room changed the atmosphere without a single word being spoken. None of them got there by being the most verbal. They got there by being the most deliberate. Every word they chose to say carried weight precisely because they hadn't wasted words on things that didn't deserve them. There is a psychological principle at work here that goes far beyond philosophy. Scarcity creates value. What is always available is rarely appreciated. When supply is limited and demand is high, the price goes up. The same is exactly true of your attention, your words, your engagement. When you respond to everything, your responses cost nothing. They're abundant, expected, reliable. Nobody treats them as precious because they never have to wait for them. But when you are selective, when people understand through experience that you don't simply engage with everything that comes your way, your engagement becomes meaningful. People listen differently when you speak, not because you've demanded it, but because they've learned through your behavior that when you open your mouth, it tends to matter. Let's be honest about how difficult this is to practice, because the pull to respond is not just habit. It runs deeper than that. It's tied to some of our most fundamental psychological needs: the need to be understood, the need to be seen accurately, the need to correct false narratives about ourselves, the need to defend our integrity when it feels attacked. Those needs are real, they're human, there's nothing wrong with them in principle. But when those needs are running on autopilot, when you are defending yourself without choosing to, when you are explaining yourself to people who were never going to understand you anyway, when you are trying to control how you are perceived by people whose perception of you has no bearing on who you actually are, those needs become chains. And silence, chosen, deliberate, purposeful silence, is how you break them. This is not about becoming someone who never speaks. It's not about becoming emotionally unavailable or socially withdrawn. It's about becoming someone who speaks with intention, who chooses engagement rather than defaulting to it, who reserves their full presence for things that genuinely deserve it, and in doing so, makes that presence something worth having. Law 3. Stop explaining yourself to people who have already decided. Here is something you need to hear plainly, even if it's uncomfortable. There are people in your life, right now, today, who have already made up their minds about you, about your motives, about your character, about what you meant when you said that thing 3 weeks ago or 3 years ago. And no matter how carefully you choose your words, no matter how patiently you explain yourself, no matter how many times you circle back and try again with a different angle, they are not going to hear you. Not because they're evil, not even necessarily because they dislike you, but because they are looking at you through a lens that was built long before this conversation, shaped by their own experiences, their own wounds, their own interpretations of reality. What they see when they look at you isn't entirely you. It's you filtered through everything they already are, and no amount of explanation can clean a lens from the outside. This is one of the most energy-draining patterns that humans fall into, the cycle of over-explanation, and it almost always comes from a good place. You want to be understood. You care about fairness. You believe that if you can just get someone to see your actual intentions, the relationship or the situation will improve. Sometimes that's true. Sometimes a clear, well-timed explanation genuinely does clear the air. We're not dismissing that. But there's a version of explanation that has nothing to do with clarity and everything to do with anxiety. It's the explanation you offer before anyone even questions you. It's the justification you rush to provide for decisions that needed no justification. It's the impulse to make sure everyone in the room knows your reasoning, your intentions, your context, because somewhere, deep down, you don't feel entirely secure unless they do. That version of explanation is not communication. It's a bid for approval. And every time you engage in it, you teach the people around you that your sense of stability depends on their understanding. You've handed them a lever, even if you didn't mean to. Seneca wrote that the first step toward freedom is refusing to be disturbed by things that cannot be changed. And the way people perceive you, by and large, that is something you cannot change. You can influence it slightly over time through consistent behavior. But you cannot control it in the moment by talking more. So what do you do instead? You come back to yourself. You ask one question, not, how do I make them understand? But, do I understand myself in this moment? Do you know what you meant? Do you know what your intentions were? Are you clear within yourself about your own reasoning? If the answer is yes, then you already have what you were looking for. The clarity, the accuracy, the sense of being seen correctly. The only difference is you've stopped outsourcing those things to other people and started finding them within yourself. That shift, from external validation to internal clarity, is one of the most profound things the Stoics ever articulated, and it's one of the hardest to actually practice because we're wired for social approval. We evolved in small groups, where being understood by your community was genuinely a survival mechanism. But the modern world is not that small group. Most of the people whose opinions you're managing aren't even central to your life, and yet you're spending enormous quantities of mental and emotional energy trying to make sure they see you the right way. What would happen if you stopped? Not all at once, not dramatically, but gradually. What would happen if you started choosing, case by case, interaction by interaction, whether this particular person's understanding of you was actually worth the cost of pursuit? In some cases, it absolutely is. Close relationships, people you work with daily, situations where clarity is practically necessary and the other person is genuinely open to receiving it. In those cases, explain clearly and fully. But in all the other cases, the ones where you're explaining yourself out of discomfort or habit or the vague anxiety of being misread, the Stoic move is simple. Let it go. Stay clear within yourself. Let your actions over time speak what your words in the moment cannot. And here's what you'll find when you actually do this. The weight lifts. The mental space that was consumed by anticipating misunderstandings, rehearsing explanations, and managing perceptions becomes available for something else, for actual thinking, for actual focus. for actually living your life instead of constantly narrating it to an audience that wasn't paying that much attention anyway. Law 4. The person who controls the pace controls the power. Speed is seductive. We live in a world that has made speed synonymous with capability. The fastest reply, the quickest turnaround, the person who never keeps you waiting. We read all of these as signs of sharpness, efficiency, value. And in many contexts, that reading has merit. But there's a subtler game happening in human interaction that operates on a different set of rules. And in that game, speed is often a liability. When you consistently respond quickly, when you are always immediately available, always ready to engage, always the first to reply, you establish a pattern. And patterns, once established, become expectations. And expectations, once established, become entitlements. The person who always replies within 5 minutes will be judged by others, and perhaps by themselves, if they ever take an hour. The person who is always available becomes someone who is expected to be available. And the moment that availability is perceived as a given, it loses its value. Marcus Aurelius wrote repeatedly about the value of slowing down, not in terms of laziness or avoidance, but in terms of deliberateness, of making sure that his actions came from his character, not from the momentum of circumstance. When everything around you is moving fast, the person who moves at their own pace, who doesn't get swept up in the urgency of the moment, that person stands out. They're operating from a different layer than everyone else. While others are reacting to conditions, they're responding to principles. This applies to conversations, to decisions, to how you present yourself in any given interaction. There is something quietly commanding about someone who doesn't rush, who takes a breath before answering a difficult question, who allows silence to sit in a room without rushing to fill it, who considers before committing, and it applies perhaps most powerfully to how you respond to attempts at provocation. When someone tries to get a rise out of you, whether overtly or subtly, they are attempting to accelerate you past your own deliberateness. They want you to move faster than you're ready to move, to say more than you've chosen to say, to reveal more about your emotional state than you intended to show. The Stoic response, the powerful response, is to decelerate, not to match their energy, not even to resist it directly, but simply to refuse to be accelerated by it, to stay at your own pace, regardless of what they're trying to do. This takes practice, and it takes a particular kind of comfort with discomfort, because pausing when someone expects you to respond feels uncomfortable. Allowing silence when someone is waiting for your reaction feels strange. Taking your time when the situation seems to be demanding speed feels almost transgressive. But that discomfort is not a sign that you're doing something wrong. It's a sign that you're doing something new. And new behaviors always feel foreign before they feel natural. Over time, as you practice this, as you develop the habit of choosing your pace rather than defaulting to whatever pace the situation seems to demand, something changes in how interactions unfold around you. You stop being someone who can be rushed. You stop being someone whose pace can be dictated by others, and people feel that. They adjust to it. Some will be unsettled by it. Some will respect it deeply. Either way, you're no longer playing on someone else's timeline. You're on yours. Law 5. What you do not feed cannot live. Everything in your life that drains you requires something from you to survive. The ongoing conflict that refuses to resolve. The person who keeps pulling you back into the same argument. The situation that seems to follow you from one chapter of your life to the next. The anxiety that spikes every time a particular topic comes up. None of these things exist on their own power alone. They exist because they are being fed. And in most cases, whether you realize it or not, you are the one feeding them. This is not about blame. It's not about telling you that your suffering is your own fault. It's about something much more useful than blame. It's about agency. Because if you are the one feeding a dynamic, you are also the one with the power to stop. The Stoics were unusually clear-eyed about this principle. They understood that most of what we call problems in our lives are not static conditions. They are ongoing processes. And processes require participation. Consider the simple example of conflict. Two people have a disagreement. The disagreement ends, or should end, but one person keeps bringing it back. They reference it in unrelated conversations. They bring it up when they're feeling defensive. They use it as evidence in arguments about entirely different subjects. And the other person, understandably, keeps responding to it. What would happen if the second person simply stopped engaging with the rehashing, not in an aggressive way, not by announcing, "I refuse to discuss this," just by not rising to it, by offering nothing, no new defense, no new explanation, no visible frustration at being dragged back again, by declining quietly and consistently to participate in the keeping alive of something that should have ended? The answer, in most cases, is that it dies. Not immediately. There will likely be escalation first, an increase in pressure, an intensifying of the attempt to provoke engagement. Because the person doing the re-engaging has been getting a response, and when that response suddenly stops, they will try harder before they stop trying. But eventually, without fuel, the fire goes out. This is what Zeno of Citium, the founder of Stoic philosophy, meant when he emphasized the importance of distinguishing between what is in your control and what is not. You cannot control whether someone continues to try to provoke you, but you can absolutely control whether you provide them with the reaction that makes it worthwhile. Applied more broadly, this principle asks you to do a serious audit of where your energy is going. What conversations are you having, internally and externally, that serve no purpose except to keep something painful alive? What stories are you telling yourself about people and situations that are long past? What arguments are you rehearsing in your head with people who aren't even in the room? Every one of those internal rehearsals is a feeding. Every time you replay the injustice, relive the slight, re-examine the wound, you are providing it with fresh sustenance. You are keeping it alive and vivid when it would, left unfed, begin to fade. This doesn't mean you suppress or deny what happened. The Stoics were not advocating for emotional repression. What they were advocating for was perspective, the deliberate, disciplined practice of choosing where to place your attention and recognizing that continued attention to what hurts you is not the same as processing it. Sometimes it's just the habit of suffering. The practical application of this law is one of the most powerful things you can do for your mental and emotional life. Identify one thing that you have been keeping alive through continued engagement, and choose, deliberately, consciously, to stop feeding it. Not to pretend it doesn't exist, not to suppress the feelings associated with it, but to withdraw the active energy you've been giving it, to let it sit, unfed, and see what happens. What you will discover, almost invariably, is that it is far smaller without your attention than it ever appeared to be with it. Law 6. Your standard sets your atmosphere. Raise it quietly. There's a version of personal growth that is loud. It announces itself. It posts about the changes it's making. It tells people how it's different now. It needs others to recognize the shift in order to feel that the shift is real. And then there's the Stoic version. The Stoic version of raising your standard is almost entirely internal. It happens through decisions, not declarations, through behavior, not broadcasts, through consistent, quiet choices that accumulate over time into something unmistakable. Not because you told anyone about it, but because people simply begin to feel the difference in how you move. Marcus Aurelius kept his philosophical practice private. The Meditations, now one of the most widely read philosophical texts in human history, were personal journals. They were not written for publication. They were written for himself. The work he did on himself was between him and himself. The results of that work were visible to everyone around him. That's the model. When you raise your internal standard, when you decide quietly and firmly what you will and will not accept in your environment, in your relationships, in your own behavior, you don't need to announce it. The change announces itself. You start engaging differently. You respond to fewer things. You ignore what isn't worth your attention. You stop rewarding behavior that doesn't deserve a reward. You stop showing up to every conflict you're invited to. And the people around you feel this. Some will test it. They'll push harder, try different angles, see if the change is real or just temporary. This is normal. When a system that was predictable becomes unpredictable, it generates pressure. Your job during that testing phase is simply to remain consistent, not to explain yourself, not to defend the standard you've set, just to hold it, again and again, until it becomes the undeniable reality of who you are. And this is where we need to talk about something that almost no one discusses when they talk about personal power: the discomfort of being consistent when no one is congratulating you for it. It would be easy if every time you chose not to react, you were rewarded. But that's not how it works. Most of your best moments of discipline will happen in private, unobserved, with no external validation whatsoever. You'll choose not to send the message. You'll choose not to engage with the provocation. You'll choose to let the false narrative stand uncorrected. And the room will be quiet, and nobody will know. And you will have to find the reward entirely within yourself. That is the hardest part, and it is also, ultimately, the point. Because the entire goal of this practice is to become someone who doesn't need the external validation, whose sense of self is anchored in their own choices, their own clarity, their own alignment with their values, not in whether the people around them are applauding. When you reach that point, and it is a gradual point, not a sudden one, you will find that the world around you has changed. Not because the world changed, but because you are no longer looking at it through the lens of needing it to respond to you in a particular way. You've set a standard, quietly, consistently, unannounced, and the world slowly has adjusted to it. Law 7. What you tolerate is what you teach people to do to you. This is one that most people understand intellectually, long before they apply it practically. And the gap between knowing it and living it is where enormous amounts of suffering take place. Every interaction you have with another person teaches them something. It teaches them what you respond to, what you ignore, what you're willing to accept, where your limits actually are versus where you say they are. And people, not always consciously, not always maliciously, learn from this. They calibrate their behavior toward you based on what they observe produces results. If you consistently engage when provoked, you teach people that provoking you works. If you consistently explain yourself when questioned, you teach people that questioning you produces explanations. If you consistently make yourself available regardless of how you're treated, you teach people that your availability is not contingent on anything. None of this is necessarily intentional on anyone's part. It's just the mechanics of human interaction, operating below the level of conscious decision-making, the way most of our social dynamics do. Epictetus spoke often about the importance of guarding the entrance to your mind. Not everything that comes at you deserves to enter. Not every comment deserves to take up residence in your thoughts. Not every conflict deserves your participation. And here's the critical insight. You are the gatekeeper, every single time. Not sometimes. Not in the big moments when it's obvious what's at stake. Every single time. The small moments, the seemingly trivial interactions, the casual disrespects that you might be tempted to let slide because it doesn't seem worth the energy. All of those moments are teaching something. The question is only what. This does not mean becoming rigid, combative, or hair-trigger in your responses. It doesn't mean calling out every microaggression or turning every social interaction into a negotiation of terms. What it means is much simpler than that. It means developing clarity about what aligns with the person you're becoming, and gently, consistently, without drama or announcement, withdrawing your engagement from what doesn't. Not withdrawing from people, just from dynamics, from patterns, from the specific ways of interacting that pull you away from your center. And when you do this, when you stop tolerating, not loudly but simply through consistent behavior, the most remarkable thing often happens. Relationships improve, not because anyone sat down and had a serious conversation about boundaries, but because the other person, reading your behavior, gradually adjusts theirs. The dynamic shifts because you shifted first. This is one of the quietest and most profound forms of influence available to a human being. Not telling others what to do, not making demands, not having difficult conversations that produce defensiveness and resistance. Just changing your own behavior, consistently and without explanation, and watching the world around you reorganize itself in response. Law 8. The mind that is not directed will always be captured. Here is the truth about your attention that no one likes to say directly. If you are not choosing where it goes, someone else is. This is not a conspiracy. It doesn't require malicious intent. It's just the nature of a world that is full of things competing for the most valuable resource you possess. Your focused awareness. The Stoics were writing about this problem in the 1st and 2nd centuries, long before there were smartphones or social media or 24-hour news cycles. Even then, with comparatively limited technology and media, they recognized that the undirected mind is a mind in captivity. Seneca wrote that it is not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste a lot of it. That the problem is not scarcity of time. The problem is that we squander what we have, not through intention, but through inattention. The undirected mind wanders by default to what is most stimulating. This is not a character flaw, it's neurobiology. Our brains are wired to prioritize novelty, threat, and social information. In the ancestral environment, this was functional. Today, it means your attention is a target that is being systematically captured by every piece of content, every notification, every controversy engineered specifically to hijack the parts of your brain that can't resist what is new, alarming, or socially relevant. And the cost is not just distraction, it's identity, because what you pay attention to, over time, is what you become. The mental and emotional patterns you rehearse repeatedly, whether through the content you consume, the conversations you engage in, the thoughts you return to, those patterns deepen. They become the default grooves through which your mind moves. If those grooves are shaped by things outside your control, by outrage, by comparison, by the curated versions of other people's lives, by constant low-grade anxiety about events you can neither influence nor escape, then your character is being formed by those things, not by you. The Stoic solution to this is both ancient and radical in its application to the modern world: directed attention, not obsessive control of every thought, not the rigid suppression of every distraction, but the deliberate, regular practice of asking, is what I'm paying attention to right now aligned with who I'm trying to become? Does this deserve my best focus? Is this how I would choose to spend my awareness if I were choosing consciously? This practice, which Marcus Aurelius returned to in some form virtually every day of his reign, is not complicated, but it runs directly counter to the default operation of the modern mind, which is to follow stimulation wherever it leads and call that engagement. What you'll find, if you begin practicing it seriously, is that large portions of what you've been paying attention to don't actually interest you when you choose consciously. They were capturing your attention, not because you valued them, but because they were engineered to be difficult to look away from. And the space that opens up when you reclaim that attention, the mental quiet, the reduction in ambient anxiety, the increased capacity for genuine thought, is remarkable, not because you've added something, but because you've stopped giving yourself away. Law 9. True freedom is mastery of self, not mastery of others. We need to address a misconception that runs through a lot of content about power, psychology, and influence, including some that positions itself as Stoic. The goal of everything we've been discussing is not to become better at controlling other people. It's not to develop psychological tactics that give you an edge in social dynamics. It's not to make yourself intimidating, or to win more arguments, or to become impossible to read as a strategic advantage. Those might be side effects in certain contexts, but they are not the point. The Stoics were unambiguous about this. The only domain of mastery worth pursuing, the only one that is genuinely available to you, and the only one that produces anything resembling lasting satisfaction, is mastery of yourself, not control over your circumstances. Circumstances change regardless of how well you manage them. Not control over how others perceive you. Perceptions are formed by processes you can influence, but never fully determine. Not control over outcomes, which depend on 1,000 variables beyond your reach. Mastery of your judgments, your values, your responses, your attention, your character. These are yours, completely, permanently, and entirely yours. No external force can take them from you. Not misfortune, not other people, not even time. Whatever happens to you, whatever is taken from you, whatever falls apart around you, your ability to choose how you respond to it remains. Epictetus, who was enslaved for years, taught this not as theory, but as lived reality. He was someone who had almost every external freedom taken from him, and he became, by the accounts of those who knew him, one of the freest people who ever lived. Because he understood that freedom was never in the external circumstances to begin with. Marcus Aurelius, on the opposite end of the social spectrum, emperor, possessor of arguably the most extensive external power a human being has ever held, wrote with the same conviction: the empire did not make him free. His practice made him free. The daily, disciplined, private work of examining his own responses, his own judgments, his own tendencies. That was what created the stability and the clarity that he's remembered for 2,000 years later. The insight that both men arrived at from opposite ends of the power spectrum is the same. True freedom is internal, and it is available equally to anyone willing to pursue it. What this means practically is that the practices we've been discussing, choosing your responses, guarding your attention, refusing to feed what doesn't deserve feeding, setting quiet standards, withdrawing from automatic engagement, none of these are about becoming better at influencing the external world. They are about creating a more stable, more authentic, more genuinely free internal world. One that is not at the mercy of what happens around you. One that is not continuously reshaped by every interaction, every opinion, every attempt at provocation or manipulation. One that is yours. That's the goal. Not power over others. Power over yourself. The quiet, unshakable, daily renewed power of someone who has decided, not once but continuously, how they want to engage with their one life. Law 10. The long game is the only game worth playing. We are living in a cultural moment that is deeply hostile to long-term thinking. Everything, the platforms we use, the media we consume, the social dynamics we navigate, is optimized for immediate feedback, immediate reaction, immediate gratification, the dopamine of a quick reply, a fast resolution, a visible response that confirms you were heard. And the Stoics, who lived in their own version of a fast, chaotic, demanding world, had a consistent answer to this. Patience is not passive. Patience is a form of power. The person who is playing the long game, who is not desperate to resolve every tension today, who is not anxious to be understood immediately, who is not reactive to every short-term provocation because they can see the longer arc of where they're headed, that person operates from a fundamentally different kind of stability than someone who is optimizing for how this moment feels. Marcus Aurelius spent years leading campaigns that went badly, years managing a Senate that was difficult, often corrupt, and frequently disrespectful, years dealing with public crises that he couldn't control. And he wrote over and over in his private journals about the importance of holding the long view, about remembering that this specific difficulty, however real, however frustrating, was one small piece of a much larger story. That doesn't mean dismissing present difficulty. It means putting it in its proper proportion. Here is the long game as it applies to everything we've discussed today. Every time you choose not to react impulsively, you're making a deposit into a kind of internal account. Every time you maintain your standard when it would have been easier to let it slip, every time you choose silence over noise, every time you withdraw your attention from what doesn't deserve it and redirect it toward what does, all of these small choices accumulate. They don't produce immediate visible results. That's the uncomfortable truth about this kind of work. You will not choose not to react to something today, and tomorrow someone will comment on how composed you've become. That's not how it works. What happens instead is slower and more total, over months, over years. The automatic reactions that once felt inevitable begin to lose their grip. The need for external validation that once drove so much of your behavior begins to quiet. The sense of being at the mercy of what happens around you, that chronic low-grade vulnerability, begins to dissolve. And what replaces it is something that is genuinely difficult to describe to someone who hasn't experienced it, because it doesn't look like anything dramatic from the outside. It looks like calm. It looks like steadiness. It looks like someone who moves through their life with an unhurried sense of purpose. It feels from the inside like freedom. Not freedom from difficulty, not freedom from loss or challenge, or the full complexity of a human life. The Stoics never promised that, and neither should anyone interpreting them, but freedom from being controlled by it. Freedom from needing circumstances to be different in order to feel stable. Freedom from the exhausting project of managing other people's perceptions and defending yourself from their misunderstandings and reacting to their provocations. That freedom is real, it's available, and it's built one choice at a time, over a long time, by someone who has decided that the short game, fast reactions, instant gratifications, the relief of blowing up in the moment, is simply not worth the cost. We've covered a lot of ground. 10 laws, thousands of years of philosophical wisdom, practical frameworks for changing some of the deepest, most ingrained patterns of how you engage with your life. But I want to end with something simple, because the truth is, all of this, every law we discussed, every Stoic principle, every shift in perspective, comes down to one thing: a choice, not a grand, life-changing, announcement-worthy choice. A small, quiet, private, daily choice. The choice, every single time something tries to pull you out of your center, to decide, consciously, deliberately, how you want to respond. Sometimes you'll choose to engage. Sometimes you'll choose silence. Sometimes you'll choose to explain, and sometimes you'll choose to let your actions speak. The point is not which option you choose. The point is that you choose, that you are aware in the moment, that you are the author of your response rather than simply the product of your reaction. Marcus Aurelius woke up every morning as emperor of the most powerful empire on earth and made that choice. Epictetus made that choice from a position of literal slavery. Seneca made it in the halls of power and in exile and in facing his own death. None of them had it figured out. None of them were perfect. They wrote about their failures as often as their successes, but they kept choosing. They kept returning to the practice. They kept refusing to surrender.